They're the people you thought you knew and the people you want to know more about. The all-new Biography Channel. Step out of your life and into the lives of movie stars and moguls. From their most dramatic on-screen performances to the untold drama of their lives.
Every night, you could live another life.
Movies, biographies, and documentaries. 24 hours a day. The Biography Channel. Call your cable operator or satellite provider.
Have you ever dreamed of exploring another world? Could you witness something new? Push boundaries? Or reach for your greatest hope? The experience of every generation is yours. On the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
History is marked with the dates of great turning points. July 4th, 1776, December 7th, 1941, and now, September 11th, 2001. Hello, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to the History Channel and our special series, The 9/11 Year. On the evening of September 11th, President Bush called on America and its allies to mount and win a war against terrorism. Some called it the start of World War III. It has been a new kind of war against an enemy who is not a nation but an international network of terrorists. Through the eyes of journalists and soldiers on the front lines, we'll take a look back at the successes and failures of the war against terror in Afghanistan and the defense on the home front, from airline and airport security to shoe bombs and anthrax. Join us now as the History Channel presents War on Terror, Year in Review.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit.
I never had a doubt that we were going to go to war and essentially to all-out war.
This morning, Afghan troops have been lobbing tank shell after tank shell into Al-Qaeda positions on Tora Bora Mountain.
Little more than 2 months after the first U.S. bombs fell on Afghanistan, the dictatorial Taliban rule no longer.
People were happy and laughing and high-fiving as you went in. The men were shaving off their beards, and it felt good.
We're a long, long way from the end of this war, and America will never be the same again.
The prospects of a future attack on the U.S. are almost a certainty. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, it could happen next year.
It's 8:52 here in New York. We understand that there has been a plane crash. A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that.
I stood there, frozen, for a minute. I don't remember how long I stood there, just listening and trying to absorb what I was seeing and what I was hearing.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right? Oh my gosh, another plane has just hit. It hit another building.
We looked up and we saw what looked like pieces of paper floating down from the building. And then I'll never forget one of the police officers, the detective, said, "Oh my God, it's a person." For me, at that moment, that's when 9/11 became real.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon.
And then all of a sudden to see this pillar of smoke coming up from the Pentagon, you say, it can't be. It can't be.
I called the Bureau just to see what the latest was. The Bureau Chief said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm at the foot of Capitol Hill." And she said, "Get out of there." Said, "We've got a report. There's another plane headed toward Washington, and we think it's headed toward the Capitol." Let's get away from the building, ladies and
And the circle of terror just keeps expanding, and you just can't sort of assimilate it all.
Well, of course, it turned out that the plane we all thought was headed toward the Capitol was the one that the brave passengers forced down in Pennsylvania. I've thought many times about it. It may well be that I owe my own life to those passengers who forced that plane down.
Go, 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 keep going, let's go, get out of here!
A catastrophe on the tip of Manhattan.
Almost right away, the Al-Qaeda cell phone network had lit up with everybody talking about this great attack. And of course, some, at least, of those phones are monitored by U.S. intelligence, and so they were picking up this sort of high fives on the cell phone network over this attack. And that's why bin Laden surfaced immediately as the prime suspect.
It doesn't take a genius to figure out the fact that Osama bin Laden was trying at that time to strike at the United States. He had been steadily escalating his attacks, and there had been a previous attempt on the World Trade Center.
Just in from New York City, the National Guard has been called out to help with the situation in New York City. No surprise there.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
For the first time in the nation's history, the entire commercial aviation system is shut down.
We began to see military planes flying overhead. And at that point you thought, oh my God, this is war.
Toward the late evening, all the members of Congress began to come back into the Capitol when it was opened up again and the danger was thought to be over. They assembled on the Capitol steps that evening, about 300 of them, in just kind of a show of solidarity. And spontaneously, nobody knows how or why it happened, they all just began to sing "God Bless America."
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
I believe it was one of the most moving scenes that I can ever recall in more than 30 years in Washington, to see them all there.
This act will not stand. We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running, and we'll bring them to justice.
Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation released a list of 19 individuals who have been identified as hijackers aboard the 4 airliners that crashed on Tuesday.
Most astonishing is that some may have lived here off and on for years while they attended flight schools and burrowed into their American communities.
They just blended in so well that, I mean, it didn't really mean anything to us, you know, just normal families.
We've conducted hundreds of interviews around the country. We've served over 30 search warrants in various places. Hundreds of subpoenas have been issued.
They did not have, it now appears, a great support mechanism in the United States. There was no ringleader here. There was no grand paymaster here. This was all conjectured in Germany, funded from overseas. The only recent hard leads appear to be coming out of Germany, where investigators have repeatedly run across the trail of Mohammed Atta.
It was here in this simple Hamburg apartment that authorities believe hijacker Mohammed Atta and 5 other Muslim fundamentalists plotted the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. All 6 men are believed to have spent time in the mid-1990s training at bin Laden terror camps inside Afghanistan.
Mohammed Atta, the FBI clearly believes, was the ringleader. He was the man who met most frequently with bin Laden operatives in Germany.
All roads lead to Osama bin Laden.
My message is for everybody who wears the uniform, get ready. The United States will do what it takes to win this war.
I never had a doubt that we were going to go to war, and essentially to all-out war.
The target? Afghanistan, ruled by a man called Mullah Omar and the fundamentalist Taliban, who had created a safe haven for Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. The aim? Hunt down the terrorists behind the 9/11 attacks.
The airstrikes began at 30 minutes past noon and will continue for a few hours more. They are targeting both Osama bin Laden's training camps and Taliban military installations.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
The plan was a punishing air campaign combined with limited use of American ground forces. The U.S. would support the Northern Alliance, a ragtag opposition army that had been fighting the Taliban for years.
The American forces went in to work with them to help them set up ambushes and what have you, but also to gather intelligence and to encourage them, to let these people know, we're with you, we're going to fight with you. That's essential if you're going to foment internal revolt against a well-entrenched force like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
U.S. troops found themselves fighting in a country whose rugged terrain and warrior culture had discouraged invaders from Tsarist Russia to the British Empire. With a population less than a tenth of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan's fierce mujahideen, or holy warriors, fought the Russians to a standstill in the 1980s. It was a unique and challenging battleground for American forces.
It was a lot more mountainous than I expected. It was desolate. There's no signs of technology there, and that just amazed me.
The most unconventional sight of that war, maybe any war, was the sight of special forces riding into battle on horseback with the Northern Alliance troops.
We trained in everything, but we didn't train in horses. The first time I got on a horse, it was like, all right, well, where are we going? So and they pointed up this mountain. It was like a 3,000-foot mountainside, and it was like, all right, I just had to learn how to ride that horse as I went along.
They may have ridden horses, but they carried laser designators, handheld devices that marked targets for the waves of airplanes overhead.
Once the special forces hooked up with these Northern Alliance units, then they could start spotting the targets more accurately. And that's when the bombing really became effective.
The Northern Alliance essentially held a small part of northern Afghanistan. What U.S. bombing was intended to do was to help them dislodge the Taliban.
When I was in northern Afghanistan, the story was a series of small battles. The battle for small villages in northern Afghanistan that the Taliban now controlled, that United Front had to gain control of. And they were as brutal as battles can be.
It wasn't until November 10th, more than a month after U.S. bombing began, that the Northern Alliance won their first big victory in a key city in the north.
The action is in and around Mazar-e-Sharif, a vital gateway to the country's interior.
And then the Northern Alliance was much bolder about advancing, and that's when the Taliban collapsed, first in Mazar-e-Sharif, then sort of all around that ring road that goes around Afghanistan. It was almost like dominoes, the Afghan domino theory.
Only a couple of days later, the action shifted south.
The target now, the Afghan capital of Kabul. Clearly there's a sense of momentum with the United Front. Their troops are now slowly making their way south.
It is a march made possible by American military muscle. From dusk to dawn, B-52 bombers leave their signature on the skyline and their footprint on the ground. We are confident, more confident than ever, says this United Front general, adding we will soon take the capital.
Outrunning even the most optimistic predictions, forces of the anti-Taliban United Front rolled into Kabul today on the heels of fleeing Taliban troops.
Dawn broke over a new day and a new reality in Kabul.
Our country is free.
The sound of music, forbidden under the Taliban, was once again heard on the streets of Kabul. Barbers opened for business, razors came out, and beards, required under Taliban law, came off. Women who've been undercover for the last 5 years shyly shed their veils.
With the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif and Kabul, only one city in northern Afghanistan remained in Taliban control.
According to United Front commanders, Taliban troops and Al-Qaeda guerrilla forces have converged in Kunduz, backed up by 40 tanks and 100 pieces of artillery, all preparing for a bloodbath.
The Battle of Kunduz was the last big fight in northern Afghanistan. The United Front had control of that part of the country, except for Kunduz. It was the Taliban's last stronghold. And it was probably the longest battle. It went on for several days.
After nearly 2 weeks of bombings and bloodshed, the last city was finally liberated. These are the images the United Front wanted the world to see.
People were happy and laughing and high-fiving as you went in. And soldiers were screaming and laughing, and the men were shaving off their beards, and it felt good. And then we'd turn a corner and you would see bodies laying on the ground. Taliban and Al-Qaeda soldiers that the United Front had executed. And according to the witnesses, many of these men had their hands up. They had surrendered. The Northern Alliance would tie their big toes together, sort of a sign of humiliation, and then force them to run down the street. Then they'd shoot them in the head. One more example of the brutality that existed, and in some ways still exists in Afghanistan.
That brutality vividly emerged in the fight for control of the Qala Junga prison near the city of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan in late November.
One of the big problems when there was this sudden collapse of the Taliban around Mazar-e-Sharif is, what do you do with all those soldiers? So you have this medieval fortress that is just crammed with prisoners being held, I'm sure, under unspeakable conditions by the Northern Alliance.
The Qala Junga fortress is about 10 miles from Mazar-e-Sharif. It takes about 20-30 minutes to get there. The roads aren't very good.
The job of the preliminary screening of all these prisoners fell to these two CIA officers. One we still only know by the name of Dave, and the other we know now is Michael Spahn. And it is in the course of interrogating them that the prisoners revolt, and they grab some weapons from the Northern Alliance soldiers who are guarding them.
I think up to 40 were killed in that initial melee there in the southern compound.
And of course, Michael Spahn is either killed instantly or wounded and dragged away and killed.
I worked my way around to the south end of the fortress, and to the west you could see this field of bodies, and somewhere on that field lay Spahn's body. I stayed on the northeast tower for a couple of hours through the firefight, but eventually came down over the wall just in time to meet U.S. Special Forces personnel and 10th Mountain Division troops. They had come to call in an airstrike in effort to eliminate Taliban resistance within the fort.
And it's during the American bombing that we have the first friendly fire accident.
We're going on the building that's in the center of the compound, the house.
You know, when the aircraft came, we started talking to them, gave them the information that we needed to give them.
They were giving the GPS coordinates.
Hey, Mr. B advised, they're about ready to drop. Pull back at this time. Okay.
At one point you hear somebody say, "You're probably too close, pull back at this time."
And they get the coordinates mixed up.
Heads up, there's shrapnel inbound!
And in fact, the bomb hits very close to where some American Special Forces were.
This is wrong, very wrong.
You know, basically, next thing you know, I was kind of flying through the air, and everything kind of went black.
There's a tank up there that we were sort of hiding behind for cover most of the morning. It took the tank and flipped it up, ripped the turret from the tank, killed those guys inside, blew a bunch of Northern Alliance guys completely off the northeast tower.
My sight went out, my ears, I couldn't hear anything because I guess the explosion just ruptured my eardrums on the spot.
After U.S. personnel collected their wounded, there was a lull in the fighting. At the same time, the United Front began moving troops back into the fortress. Finally, they brought in one of the T-55 tanks, and they just began pounding the rooms along that southeastern wall where they thought the Taliban were hiding, just shot after shot. And by dusk, the battle was pretty much over.
And those were the first friendly fire casualties of the Afghan war, unfortunately not the last.
Another American who fell in Afghanistan was buried today with full military honors.
And I think one of the most gut-wrenching pictures that I ever saw was the flag-draped casket of Johnny Spann coming down this little incline in Arlington. with a full honor guard and followed by his family, his wife, his father.
And thank you for giving me the greatest honor of my whole life, and that was to be called your wife.
Semper Fi, my love. As a reporter, you don't need to add any words to that.
With most of northern Afghanistan in the hands of the Northern Alliance by early December, the focus of the action turned south to the city of Kandahar.
The place you had to get to was Kandahar, which was the seat of power of the Taliban.
Kandahar was a big focus of attention because it's where Mullah Omar was, it's where Osama bin Laden spent, we think, a fair amount of time. He certainly spent a lot of money there.
The southern end of Kandahar province may be the Taliban's last stronghold, but from all outward appearances it remains very much under their control.
The fight for Kandahar saw the first significant use of U.S. ground troops.
U.S. Marines are inside Afghanistan on an operation designed to surround and cut off what is now the last remaining Taliban stronghold.
We now have forces that can more successfully interdict highways and main routes of transportation and communication.
We noticed that there was a vehicle parked in the mountain pass, and behind it was a pretty long convoy of vehicles. Immediately we vectored in the F-18s and they took out the first few vehicles. And so we talked the aircraft on to different targets and basically proceeded to annihilate the convoy.
Well, we did reconnaissance missions with aircraft throughout the whole time frame until we did move down toward Kandahar.
The principal function of this operation is to support anti-Taliban forces trying to march on Kandahar from two different directions. U.S. troops won't be storming the city, but neither will they be allowing any Taliban or Al-Qaeda to escape to fight another day.
To our surprise, they didn't try to launch any ambushes, they didn't try to block any of the passes. They really just started crumbling and withdrawing back to Kandahar.
The Marines sent out what they call hunter-killer teams to basically interdict any Al-Qaeda and Taliban that might be fleeing from Kandahar.
In their first offensive encounter, a hunter-killer unit from this base hit a 3-car convoy beyond the perimeter last night, killing 7.
The idea of the hunter-killer teams was just to get out there, sow confusion, sow fear, sow uncertainty, and grab any bad guys that you can find. It was quite effective, actually.
I think it was only a matter of time then before Kandahar fell. But in the process, the U.S. lost some good soldiers.
It happened in early December as U.S. forces pressed the fight around Kandahar.
A high-flying B-52 dropped a 2,000-pound bomb which landed about 300 feet away from the Americans. Way too close.
Out of the blue, a big cloud of smoke and a loud boom it hit. The first thing I thought it was enemy fire. I remember yelling, incoming, incoming.
I had shrapnel, actually. I had a piece going here in my wrist.
And I had wounds up in my scalp area and my neck. I remember just seeing the blood dripping down.
And then I had a piece go through my back and it went in my lung, through the artery in my heart, and it came out. They pulled it out of this area right here, right up under my arm.
This was the worst friendly fire incident of the war. Somewhere in the chain of transmission from that Special Forces soldier on the ground determining the coordinates of the target he wanted the bomb to hit to the plane that was going to drop the bombs, something got mixed up and the bomb dropped not on the target but on the position of the Special Forces soldier that was calling in the strike.
The anger wasn't towards, any one person. The anger was towards the death of my friends. These are my buddies. This is my team sergeant. This is, my friend.
Jefferson Davis was the team sergeant. He was the father figure of the team. Dan Pettitori had been in the company for years. He was a very dynamic figure. Everybody knew Dan. People who'd met Dan for 5 minutes would never forget him.
And it's just upsetting when you lose somebody close. I mean, we're really close.
family. We're all like brothers.
Little more than 2 months after the first U.S. bombs fell on Afghanistan, the dictatorial Taliban rule no longer. Not even Kandahar, the city where their movement was born and where today it collapsed.
And even though it wasn't the last city to fall, it was the most symbolic. When Mullah Omar was driven out of Kandahar to God knows where, that was a sign that the people who had ruled this country for the last several years were finally gone.
Among the many things people in this one-time capital of the Taliban want to tell a newly arrived correspondent, the most heartening is that their children's future is brighter than it has been for a generation. These boys were on their way to a political rally in a football stadium the Taliban used for public executions.
It came alive, certainly. I mean, they suddenly saw things you knew had never been there before, like satellite dishes sprouting everywhere, and music cassette shops, and video shops, and people singing and dancing.
In an act made poignant more by its symbolism than its ceremony, an 18 by 12-foot flag that flew at Ground Zero was raised over Kandahar Airport by U.S. Marines shortly after dawn this morning. The flag was sent to the Marines by the New York City Police Department, a show of patriotism, support, and defiance.
Seeing the Ground Zero flag unfurled, seeing the notes, dedications, the thank yous on it, that meant something to them. It was a big deal. The feeling among the Marines and soldiers that went to Afghanistan was different than any I've ever experienced before. I've covered, I don't know, a lot of wars. Soldiers gripe. That's a soldier's, it's a soldier's right to bitch and complain. I never heard them complain. They desperately wanted to be in Afghanistan. There was no argument about why they were there or whether they should be there. They knew.
But the operation fell short of one of its principal aims, the capture of Mullah Omar, the head of the now deposed Taliban.
Mullah Omar remains at large, and the general in charge of hunting him down said this afternoon his whereabouts are a mystery.
As I stand here, I do not have reason to believe that Omar has in fact escaped Kandahar, nor have I seen information that he is still in Kandahar. So we simply don't know right now where Omar is.
So how did Mullah Omar get out of there? And how did all of those other Taliban fighters get out of there? The reigning belief is that the warlords who controlled that area cut a deal with the Taliban.
With the collapse of Kandahar and the Taliban, the U.S. war effort turned to hunting down Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda fighters, who were believed to be holed up in the rugged Tora Bora mountains in eastern Afghanistan.
Despite around-the-clock bombing, al-Qaeda fighters are hanging on, and according to one commander, so is Osama bin Laden.
Osama has been seen in the area?
Yeah.
How many days ago? Recently, yesterday?
Almost 3 days ago.
3 days ago, still in the area.
The best evidence, but it's not conclusive evidence, is that he was in Tora Bora. And here, I think the U.S. paid a price for not being ready for the fall of the Taliban as quickly as it happened, because the U.S. just didn't have the forces ready in sufficient numbers to go into Tora Bora.
So the U.S. was forced to rely on the same tactics it had used early in the war. U.S. Special Forces working with local troops on the ground, calling in airstrikes.
American B-52s continued to pound the mountainside, raining cluster bomb after cluster bomb on the south side of Tora Bora Mountain.
And the same problems happened. I mean, the Northern Alliance didn't want to risk its troops by advancing until they were absolutely sure that airstrikes had taken care of any opposition they were going to encounter. And so valuable time was lost.
Bombs light up the night, and the sound of what are probably American helicopters fills the air as U.S. aircraft and commandos close in on the cave complex where U.S. intelligence believes bin Laden and his al-Qaeda fighters are battling for their lives.
This morning, Afghan troops have been lobbing tank shell after tank shell into al-Qaeda positions on Tora Bora Mountain. Overnight, there was fierce fighting between small pockets of troops as the Afghans try to drive Osama bin Laden's forces completely off the mountain.
Step by step, cave by cave. That's how a U.S. Marine Corps general describes the hunt now for Osama bin Laden, which is centered in the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan.
Opposition and U.S. Special Operations Forces rolled into the Tora Bora Mountains in pursuit of fleeing al-Qaeda fighters. but the Pentagon says it's anyone's guess where bin Laden is.
I'm not sure how close we ever really have been. We have narrowed it down to an area. Indicators were there, and now indicators are not there. So maybe he still is there, maybe he was killed, or maybe he's left.
The al-Qaeda prisoners captured in Tora Bora have not given the U.S. any useful leads to bin Laden's whereabouts. Best guess, he is still on the run somewhere in the Tora Bora mountains where the bombing has stopped, but the hunt goes on.
I remember going up on this one ridgeline which had been hit by cluster bombs, and there wasn't a tree above that height still standing. If there had been any living human beings up there when those bombs fell, they would be living no longer.
For all the devastation, there is no sign of bodies. The al-Qaeda fighters are either dead and buried or have fled deeper into the mountains.
But the Special Forces soldiers pointed out something to me. You saw a lot of signs of destruction, but you didn't see any blood. There was no sign that anybody had been killed up there. So once again, the mystery, where did they go?
We'd heard all this talk about these huge caves, some of them large enough to house tanks and dozens of vehicles. We never saw that. Here's what we did see.
We're about to get our first look at one of Osama bin Laden's caves here on Tora Bora Mountain.
This cave was used to store ammunition, lots of it. This reporter estimates more than 5,000 boxes of the types of shells used in anti-aircraft guns.
One cave complex did yield a garbage bag full of propaganda pamphlets, maps, letters, and identification papers.
We'll find out how good the intel boys are when they decipher this stuff.
What we certainly did not find was Osama bin Laden. The last credible sighting of bin Laden in Tora Bora was more than a month ago on November 29th, and since then the Special Forces have not been able to pick up his scent.
Now we're hearing that possibly some of those Afghan troops may have held the door open for al-Qaeda to escape. Whether they let them go or whether the al-Qaeda forces just managed to escape, we don't know.
It wasn't until early March of 2002 that the U.S. had enough men on the ground to launch a big operation of their own to try to hunt down Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda fighters.
Soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division, along with U.S. Special Forces and Afghan fighters, several hundred troops in all, backed up by helicopters and warplanes, have attacked a concentration of al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters hiding out in the cave complexes of southeastern Afghanistan.
It was called Operation Anaconda.
Operation Anaconda may have been the last best chance to kill a whole bunch of al-Qaeda fighters.
This is the biggest operation of the war, bigger than the U.S. expected. According to a senior Pentagon official, the U.S. grossly underestimated the resistance U.S. forces would encounter when they attacked several hundred al-Qaeda fighters in the mountains of southeastern Afghanistan.
These pockets of resistance, some armed with RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, some armed with mortars, and some armed with machine guns and simply rifles, are in the crags, the nooks, and the crannies of this high ground, and our forces are right in there mixing it up with them.
We're on a movement trying to link up with 101st Airborne Division, and we stopped for a security halt, and next thing we know, a mortar round went off, so we called incoming.
And my first reaction was, holy moly, it's an ambush. We are, we got to get out of here.
And then they start opening up with an RPK, so heavy machine gun, Soviet-made. And once that happened, more machine guns start firing up.
Initially, we could not spot where the weapons were firing from.
What they would do is just rush out, spray a few rounds, and then get back under cover. And once we engaged the enemy and started putting rounds in their direction, they ran.
The fire that they were returning was just so dead-on accurate. It was just unbelievable. To survive an ambush is one of the a great accomplishment.
B-52 bombers hit positions in the valleys between the 11,000-foot peaks, where an elusive enemy believed to number anywhere from 600 to several thousand is holed up.
The battle is very intense, very heavily intense at times. There's a lot of mortar fire, machine gun fire. The enemy has heavy weaponry.
That so many al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters would seem to be gathered together would indicate that either they are trapped or they are defending some senior leaders. In either case, they can be counted on to fight fiercely and to the bitter end.
Finally, 10 days after the first U.S. helicopters full of soldiers from the 101st Airborne and 10th Mountain Divisions hit their landing zones, U.S. commanders are claiming success in Operation Anaconda after reports that hundreds of Taliban and al-Qaeda targets have been eliminated.
Well, the official version of Operation Anaconda was that it was a complete and total success. Was it really? I don't think so.
The big question about Operation Anaconda is how many al-Qaeda were killed.
Only 4 bodies were lying in the open up here, casting doubt on earlier claims that hundreds had been killed.
That guy's been there for a while.
There were grossly exaggerated claims of the number of deaths, we think, because nobody saw the bodies, nobody saw the graves.
There's no doubt in my mind, but any number of al-Qaeda have gone across various borders and do intend to fight another day, and we intend to find them.
Al-Qaeda is underground in the shadows and scattered, but they're not disbanded. We've seen that every day. We're hearing warnings about them. Every day we're seeing evidence that they're planning new things. So if the aim of the war was to destroy al-Qaeda, then the war didn't succeed, hasn't been won, there's a long way to go.
While U.S. troops took the war to Afghanistan, back home, another war was being fought.
Tonight we find ourselves in the unusual and unhappy position of reporting on one of our beloved colleagues, a member of my personal staff who has contracted a cutaneous anthrax infection.
The anthrax events began approximately 1 week after September the 11th. A series of letters were mailed to media personalities in the United States.
Tom Brokaw's office got a letter. The child of an ABC employee came down with anthrax, and Dan Rather's assistant was apparently exposed.
We are now the 3rd major television network news organization to be targeted, and it brings to 6 the number of people diagnosed with anthrax this month.
No one knew where this had come from. Was it connected to Osama bin Laden? Was there a connection to the World Trade Center's attack?
So those are very anxious times, and I think in many ways more frightening than 9/11.
At each stage of these letters, the anthrax that was discovered to be in them got more and more refined. Eventually, there was found to be a case of inhalation anthrax, extremely deadly, extremely rare, found in the case of a worker at a newspaper in Florida.
The Florida man who contracted a rare case of anthrax disease died today in the hospital. Officials stress there is no public health threat.
Every day, we would find out that this was a little more serious than we had been led to believe.
I just talked to Leader Daschle. His office received a letter, and it had anthrax in it.
And as stunned reporters soon discovered, police had already blocked off Majority Leader Daschle's Capitol Hill office and isolated staffers, while hazardous material teams combed the area with special equipment.
The anthrax became almost a fine mist in the air. That eventually contaminated a huge postal facility in Washington, D.C., where several workers were infected and some died.
My body was telling me that I am drastically sick. I felt so helpless. One of the nurses came in and put her arms around me, and she said, "You know, we're going to help you through this." And then she started crying, and we were both standing there crying in the middle of the floor.
One particular worker, I think, became the a monument to how not to conduct an anthrax investigation.
My name is Thomas L. Morris, Jr. I suspect that I might have been exposed to anthrax.
This was a worker who was at the Brentwood facility that handled the Senate anthrax letters.
A week ago, last Saturday morning at work, foreman found the envelope, and I was in the vicinity. It had powder in it. They never let us know whether the thing was anthrax or not.
He came down with all the classic symptoms of early anthrax inhalation.
and who went to the hospital complaining of those symptoms and was sent home.
In Washington, there were memorial services this day for 2 casualties of war. Friends, family, and federal officials honored 2 fallen postal workers.
The post office should have been closed immediately and treated as a crime scene. Perhaps, just perhaps, Mr. Corsine and Mr. Morris would not have died, and I would have not gotten sick.
It was weeks later before they took it to the next level of anticipation as investigators and said, no, wait a minute, if the anthrax came spewing out of these letters at the postal facility and infected the workers, what about the rest of the mail that was in there? And sure enough, that's what had happened.
Investigators looking into a baffling inhalation anthrax death here in New York City. The latest victim, an elderly woman, died today in Connecticut.
They still believe it's the product of one man, most likely an American, most likely trained at U.S. chemical biological warfare centers, most likely who was trying to kill but also trying to send a message.
And what this underlined and illustrated to all of us is that we really didn't have any disaster plan in place. People kept talking about all these plans that the government had, but when you came right down to it, nobody knew what to do, and they had to work their way through this day by day, and that in itself was pretty scary.
The anthrax scare ratcheted up the country's sense of fear. No place, it seemed, was safe from the threat of terrorism.
It was odd going to the World Series and seeing so many police officers checking bags, not for beer or alcohol, but for weapons and bombs. And that was sad. I mean, the World Series is supposed to be one of those great moments in American sports. And like everything else in America, it was interrupted by this sense of fear or danger looming.
The waves of new warnings from Washington just keep coming. Security has been tightened at such landmarks as the Statue of Liberty. Bridges and tunnels are also considered potential targets.
Police in Los Angeles today kept a close watch on skyscrapers, power plants, religious and government buildings.
Many worry terrorists might find America's 400 million acres of farmland a tempting target.
The FAA today put new restrictions on airspace around nuclear facilities.
The FBI alerted the nation's law enforcement officials about a possible terror attack tied to the 4th of July holiday.
The government was under extraordinary pressure to find a way to quantify the danger that we faced at any given moment. Because every day, Attorney General John Ashcroft seemed to play the game of let's scare America.
A terrorist threat advisory update has been issued to 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
He was only passing along what the FBI and the CIA and others were telling us.
There may be additional terrorist attacks within the United States and against United States interests over the next week.
The scenario I know that scares the FBI most is the simplest procedure of all, and that is another attack involving U.S. commercial aviation.
Since September 11th, things have been done to try to secure the airplane itself. Things have been done to try to secure the airports, to try to know more about who the passengers are. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was.
But improving security came at the expense of a lot of false alarms.
Terminal evacuations and flight delays triggered by security breaches are now occurring at the rate of 1 a day.
Critics call it hair-trigger security. Airlines complain the daily evacuations are costing them millions.
Total chaos, unbelievable. We're missing our flight.
In the post-September 11th world, on any security question, they'd rather overreact than take a risk. One of the most unsettling things was an incident that happened just a few weeks after September 11th, when the heightened security supposedly was in place. When Subhash Gurung went through a United Airlines checkpoint at Chicago's O'Hare Airport on Saturday, screeners found and confiscated 2 pocket knives. What they didn't find were 7 other knives, a stun gun, and a can of mace, all stashed in the man's carry-on. The other thing that happened on the heels of that was maybe even a more frightening scenario, and that involved Richard Reed, the now so-called shoe bomber, coming on a flight from Paris.
I was sitting in my seat, and then I heard the flight attendant screaming for help, and I looked up, and she was struggling with a man trying to take matches out of his hand, I think. Between the crew and some of the passengers, they pinned the guy down and basically tied him up.
There was a cord sticking out from his foot. The shoe, in fact, was packed with plastic explosive. His plan was to blow a hole in the plane and take the plane and everybody down with it. That is a plan that FBI believes was dreamed up by and ordained by the Al-Qaeda network.
Just hours after accused shoe bomber Richard Reed tried to light an explosive in his sneakers, the FAA issued 2 urgent security orders, directing U.S. airlines to immediately begin scanning passenger shoes for bombs. But that was merely the first of what's become a flood of terrorism alerts from the FAA.
Everybody in the government that I talk to, serious people, think that these people are planning something else.
They've attacked a synagogue in Tunisia, bombed a church in Pakistan, blown up a bus carrying French workers, and bombed the U.S. consulate in Karachi.
All of this suggests to U.S. officials that Al-Qaeda has regrouped.
We have captured a known terrorist who was exploring a plan to build and explode a radiological dispersion device or dirty bomb in the United States.
The arrest of Jose Padilla, a gentleman who was accused of bringing plans for a dirty bomb to the United States, frankly led them to even more consider the fact that a network existed here.
U.S. officials say alleged American Al-Qaeda operative Jose Padilla was seeking the aid of an Al-Qaeda network inside the U.S. before he was arrested in May, and analysts say it's not hard to guess the targets.
There could be a cell here, they think, that is in fact a ticking time bomb, that has a plan in place and is awaiting the order to carry it out.
I think that the prospects of a future attack on the U.S. are almost a certainty. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, it could happen next year, but they will keep trying.
We haven't won the war on terror, that's for sure. We know that. But I think we are prosecuting the war.
We're more vigilant. We're taking precautions that we didn't take before, and anybody who's taken an airplane flight since 9/11 knows about that.
Comparing September 10th, 2001 to now, aviation security is light years better than it was. But I don't think anybody says we've eliminated the threat in the skies.
Osama bin Laden is most likely still alive and in hiding someplace. But he's basically, I think, in a survival mode right now.
In addition, the U.S. helped put in place a new Afghan government coalition that has stabilized the country. Around 7,000 American troops remain in Afghanistan as sporadic fighting continues with pockets of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in the eastern mountains. The operation has netted more than 600 rebels who are in U.S. custody.
We've arrested hundreds and hundreds of terrorists around the world.
One cell has been arrested in Morocco, planning to blow up Allied warships in the Strait of Gibraltar. Another was caught in Saudi Arabia and tied to a missile attack on U.S. planes.
So by that measure, the destruction we have done to the Al-Qaeda network, yes, we are safer.
I think if the United States government were forced to sit down and write its own report card on terror, it would probably give itself a B or a B minus. We're having to reorganize government, create and invent a whole new branch of homeland security. We're having to detain people on the flimsiest of excuses.
I also worry that in our effort to get the bad guys, that we don't create more enemies.
Is our use of weapons of war against countries like Afghanistan inciting that many more young Arabs from around the world to become radical opponents of the United States?
The dangers have not passed. This government and the American people are on watch. We are ready because we know that terrorists have more money and more men and more plans. We will not leave the safety of America and the peace of the planet at the mercy of a few mad terrorists and tyrants.
I remember what growing up for me in the United States meant. There was a sense of security. Most places, my mom guaranteed me I'd be okay, and I believed her. I can't give my daughters, my sons, that same guarantee. That, honey, today in America you'll be safe. I can't tell my children that. That makes me sad.
1 year after war was declared on terror, some have suggested that on September 11th, the terrorist movement may have written its own death warrant. But it's far too soon to declare victory or to know for sure where we will go from here. The President has said repeatedly that this is a war that requires patience, not least because it's difficult to assess how much damage has truly been inflicted on the terrorists and their operational cells. But in the midst of all the uncertainty, there is one thing that's inevitable. The war on terror will continue. For the History Channel, I'm Arthur Kent. Thanks for joining us.